My wife cheated while I was working overtime to save for our dream home. For the past 2 years, I've worked 60-hour weeks, sacrificing weekends, holidays, and precious family time to save for our dream home. I thought we were building a future together. I never imagined she was tearing it apart behind my back. From the moment we got married, my wife, Anna, and I dreamed of owning a house where we could grow old together. We'd spent countless evenings sketching out plans, pinning ideas on boards, and talking about every detail, from the color of the shutters to the garden we'd tend in the backyard. That dream became my driving force. Every overtime shift, every sleepless night, was for us, for the life we'd envisioned. But somewhere along the way, things began to change. It was subtle at first. Anna started spending more time out with her friends, claiming she needed a break while I was at work. She'd laugh off my suggestions to join her, saying, "It's just a girls' night, nothing exciting." I didn't think much of it then. She deserved to relax. After all, I was rarely around, and the burden of holding down the fort at home fell on her. Yet, there were moments I couldn't ignore. Her phone, once left carelessly around the house, became glued to her hand. Notifications were silenced, and if I walked into the room, she'd quickly lock the screen. Work emails, she'd say with a dismissive wave. When I asked about her nights out, her answers were vague, and she seemed defensive, a stark contrast to the open and loving partner I once knew. I told myself I was imagining things. Stress can play tricks on the mind, and between juggling my demanding job and trying to save money, I was under plenty of it. She's just bored, I reassured myself. Once we have the house, everything will fall into place. But deep down, an uneasy feeling lingered. I pushed it aside, focusing instead on the prize, a home for us. I'd even planned a surprise, a plot of land that I'd been eyeing for months. I was just a few paychecks away from securing the down payment. It was supposed to be the foundation of our future. Little did I know, that foundation was already crumbling. Looking back, the signs were there all along. The distance between us wasn't just physical anymore. Her smiles felt forced, her laughter hollow. I thought I was doing the right thing by working harder, sacrificing more. I thought love meant putting her needs above mine, even if it meant losing myself in the process. If only I'd seen it sooner. If only I'd known that while I was breaking my back to build our dream, she was busy tearing it apart. The uneasy feeling gnawed at me, refusing to be silenced. Days turned into weeks, and Anna's behavior only grew more suspicious. She started coming home later, often with flimsy excuses. The girls wanted to grab dessert, she'd say, her voice overly cheerful, or "I lost track of time," as she avoided my gaze. I wanted to believe her, I really did, but the cracks in our relationship were growing too wide to ignore. One evening, I came home early from a cancelled shift, hoping to surprise her with takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant. Her car wasn't in the driveway. At first, I didn't think much of it. She'd mentioned she might go shopping. But as I walked into the house, an eerie silence greeted me. Normally, the TV would be on, or music would be playing in the background. Instead, the house felt empty, cold. I set the food on the counter and texted her, "Hey, got off early. Brought your favorite pad thai. Where are you?" Minutes passed, then an hour, with no response. My gut told me something was wrong. That's when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She must have left it behind in her rush. Curiosity and dread fought within me as I picked it up. The screen lit up, revealing a message from a contact saved as Samantha. But the previewed text didn't match the name. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled as I unlocked her phone. The messages painted a picture I didn't want to see. Samantha wasn't Samantha at all. It was a man named Ryan, and the texts left little room for doubt. They spoke of secret meetups, stolen moments, and a connection that felt deeper than mere infatuation. I sat there in shock, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. My mind raced, replaying every interaction, every late-night shift, every excuse she'd given. It all made sense now, the secrecy, the defensiveness, the growing distance. When Anna finally walked through the door, the sight of her startled me. She looked radiant, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. For a moment, I thought about pretending I hadn't seen the messages, about confronting her another time. But the anger bubbling inside me wouldn't let that happen. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the takeout containers on the counter. "Out with the girls." "What's with the interrogation?" I held up her phone. "You left this behind." Her face paled as she realized what that meant. "Care to explain who Ryan is?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "It's not what you think," she stammered. "Then what is it, Anna?" My voice cracked, the hurt bleeding through. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been cheating on me while I've been working my ass off for us." Tears welled in her eyes as she sank into a chair. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I demanded, slamming the phone on the table. "You don't accidentally text someone about how amazing last night was. You don't accidentally betray your husband." Her tears flowed freely now, but I couldn't find it in me to comfort her. I felt hollow, like the life we'd built had been sucked into a black hole. She tried to explain, to justify her actions. "You've been so busy, so distant. I was lonely, and Ryan, he made me feel seen." Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. "Lonely?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think I wanted to work 60-hour weeks? Do you think I enjoyed missing dinners, weekends, time with you? I was doing it for us, Anna. For our future." "I know," she sobbed. "I know you've sacrificed so much, but I didn't know how to tell you how I was feeling." And then, it just happened. I stared at her, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, sadness, and love, all warring for dominance. I'd spent years building a life with this woman, and now it felt like it was all for nothing. "I need some time," I finally said, my voice hollow. "I can't do this right now." Without waiting for her response, I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, leaving behind the shattered pieces of what used to be our life. I spent the night at my brother's house. When I showed up at his door, looking like a man who'd lost everything, he didn't ask questions. He just pulled me into a hug and said, "Whatever you need, I'm here." The next morning, my phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages from Anna. I couldn't bring myself to answer. Each notification felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of the life I'd fought so hard for, now hanging by a thread. My brother eventually sat me down with a cup of coffee, his brow furrowed with concern. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. The words spilled out before I could stop them. I told him everything, the long hours, the texts, her excuses, and finally, the confrontation. He listened quietly, his face a mixture of anger and sadness. "You don't deserve this," he said firmly when I finished. "You've given her everything, and she's thrown it back in your face." I nodded, but his words didn't bring me the comfort I'd hoped for. Instead, they only deepened the ache in my chest. I don't know what to do now," I admitted. "How do you come back from something like this?" "You take it one step at a time," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "But first, you need to figure out what you want. Do you want to try to fix this, or is it time to let go?" The question lingered in my mind long after he'd said it. What did I want? Could I ever trust her again? And even if I could, would it be enough to repair the damage that had been done? That evening, I finally mustered the courage to check Anna's messages. Her texts were a mix of apologies, pleas, and promises to change. It was a mistake, she'd written. "I love you, not him. Please, let me fix this." But could she? And more importantly, could I let her? I didn't reply. Instead, I stared at the screen, feeling more lost than ever. The night I confronted Sarah felt like the longest of my life. After her confession, I left the house and drove aimlessly, unsure of where to go. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. Eventually, I found myself at my brother Greg's doorstep. Without a word, he let me in, handing me a beer and sitting with me in silence until I was ready to talk. When I finally opened up, the words poured out in a rush. The long hours I'd worked, Sarah's growing distance, the texts I'd found. Greg listened without interruption, his face a mix of sympathy and restrained anger. "You've given her everything, and this is how she repays you," he said, shaking his head. "You don't deserve this, man." The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face anyone, let alone focus on my job. Instead, I stayed at Greg's place, replaying everything in my mind. Sarah called and texted incessantly, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Each notification felt like a fresh wound. When I finally mustered the courage to speak to her, it was over the phone. I told her I needed space and time to think. She begged me to come home, her voice cracking with emotion. "It was a mistake, Jake," she said. "I was lonely, you were never around, and I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore." Her words stung. Had I been so consumed with providing for our future that I'd neglected our present? Or was this just an excuse for her actions? I didn't know what to believe. Over the next week, I confided in a few close friends and family members. My mom was livid, ready to march over to Sarah's house and give her a piece of her mind. My best friend, Ryan, took a more measured approach. "You need to figure out what you want, Jake," he said. "Do you think you can ever trust her again?" Trust. The word echoed in my mind. Could I ever look at Sarah the same way? Could I share a life with someone who had shattered my faith in her so completely? When I finally returned home to talk to Sarah face to face, she looked like a shadow of herself. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of her guilt had physically diminished her. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Therapy, counseling, anything. Please, just give me a chance." Her desperation was palpable, but so was my hesitation. "I need time," I said. "This isn't something I can just move past overnight." In the days that followed, Sarah tried everything to prove her remorse. She deleted the man's number, blocked him on all platforms, and even showed me messages where she ended things with him for good. She scheduled a couples therapy session and pleaded with me to attend. But every time I looked at her, all I could see was the betrayal. The image of her with someone else haunted me, intruding on my thoughts at the worst moments. I'd sacrificed so much for our future, and now I couldn't even see one with her in it. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I found myself scrolling through photos on my phone. Pictures of Sarah and me from happier times, our wedding day, vacations, birthdays. Each image was a painful reminder of what we'd had and what we'd lost. I couldn't help but wonder, had those moments been as real to her as they were to me? I knew I had to make a decision. Living in limbo was tearing me apart, and it wasn't fair to either of us. I just didn't know if my heart could withstand the choice I was about to make. The decision weighed on me like 1,000 bricks. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't think about anything other than what Sarah had done and whether we could ever rebuild. Part of me wanted to forgive her. After all, wasn't our marriage worth fighting for? But another part of me, the part that replayed those incriminating messages and imagined her with someone else, couldn't fathom moving past the betrayal. At Sarah's insistence, we went to our first couples therapy session. The therapist, a kind and composed woman named Dr. Myers, began by asking us to share our feelings. Sarah spoke first, tears streaming down her face as she recounted how lonely she'd felt while I was working long hours. "I know it doesn't excuse what I did," she said, her voice trembling. "But I felt invisible, like I didn't matter. I made a terrible mistake, and I regret it more than anything." When it was my turn, I struggled to find the right words. "I sacrificed so much for us, for our future," I said, my voice heavy with emotion. "I thought we were on the same page, working toward the same goal. But now I feel like everything I did was for nothing. How can I trust you again when you've already broken it so completely?" Dr. Myers nodded empathetically. "Trust can be rebuilt," she said, "but it takes time, effort, and a genuine commitment from both parties. Jake, you need to decide if this is something you want to work on. And Sarah, you need to be prepared for the fact that trust isn't given, it's earned." The session left me with more questions than answers. Sarah was visibly committed to making amends, but I wasn't sure if I could ever fully forgive her. Every time she reached out to hold my hand or tried to initiate a conversation, I found myself pulling away. The chasm between us felt insurmountable. One evening, I received a call from Ryan. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Barely," I admitted. "I just don't know what to do." "You need to think about what's best for you," Ryan said. "Not for her, not for anyone else. What do you want out of life, Jake? Can you see a future with her, or do you think it's time to start over?" His words lingered in my mind long after the call ended. What did I want? For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in being Sarah's husband and building a life together. But now, that life felt like a house built on quicksand, ready to collapse at any moment. A few days later, I decided to take a drive to clear my head. I ended up at the site where Sarah and I had planned to build our dream home. The empty lot was overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the vision we'd once shared. As I stood there, I couldn't help but think about all the dreams we'd poured into this place. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a symbol of everything we'd worked for. But now, it felt like a monument to everything we'd lost. That night, I sat down with Sarah for a final, honest conversation. "I need to know why," I said, looking her in the eye. "Why him? Why now? Was there something I could have done differently?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "It wasn't about him," she said. "It was about me. I felt unappreciated, like I didn't matter. But the truth is, I didn't communicate that to you. Instead of talking to you, I made the worst mistake of my life. I hate myself for what I did, Jake. I hate that I hurt you." Her words were sincere, but they didn't erase the pain. "I can't keep living like this," I said. "I feel like I'm drowning, and I don't know if we can come back from this." "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we need to separate," I said. "At least for now. I need time to figure out who I am without us, without this constant pain." Sarah broke down in tears, but she didn't argue. "If that's what you need, I'll respect it," she said. "But I hope you know how sorry I am. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make this right, even if it's too late." The next day, I packed my bags and moved into a small apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of freedom and fear. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what we once had. It was time to find out who I was on my own. The weeks following the separation were some of the hardest of my life. Every corner of my new apartment reminded me of what I'd lost, and yet, it also offered a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in years, I wasn't defined by my role as a husband or a provider. I was just me. I threw myself into work, not as a distraction, but as a way to reclaim some sense of purpose. I also started therapy on my own, which helped me process the anger, sadness, and confusion that had consumed me. My therapist encouraged me to focus on rediscovering the things that brought me joy, things I had let fall by the wayside during my marriage. I took up running again, something I hadn't done since college. Every mile I ran felt like shedding a layer of grief. I also reconnected with old friends, people I'd drifted away from during the years I'd devoted entirely to Sarah and our shared dreams. It felt good to laugh again, to talk about things that had nothing to do with heartbreak or betrayal. Sarah and I maintained minimal contact during this time. When we did speak, it was mostly about logistical matters, like dividing our assets or managing bills. She continued to express her remorse, occasionally asking if I thought we had any chance of reconciliation. Each time, I told her the same thing: I don't know. I need more time. One day, while sorting through some old boxes, I found our wedding album. Flipping through the pages, I couldn't help but smile at the photos. We looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. But as I closed the album, I realized that the people in those pictures weren't the same people we'd become. Somewhere along the way, we had lost each other, and maybe even ourselves. That realization was both painful and freeing. I could finally let go of the guilt I'd been carrying, the feeling that I hadn't done enough to save our marriage. The truth was, I had given everything I had, and it still wasn't enough. That wasn't my failure, it was just reality. Eventually, I decided to file for divorce. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the right one. When I told Sarah, she cried but said she understood. "I hope you find happiness," she said. "You deserve it." The months that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork, emotional ups and downs, and moments of clarity. By the time the divorce was finalized, I felt like a different person. I wasn't the man who had sacrificed everything for someone else's happiness anymore. I was someone who had learned to prioritize his own well-being. In the years since, my life has changed in ways I never could have imagined. I bought a small house, not the dream home Sarah and I had envisioned, but a cozy place that feels like mine. I've continued therapy, deepening my understanding of myself and my needs. I've even started dating again, cautiously but optimistically. Looking back, I can see that Sarah's betrayal, as painful as it was, forced me to confront truths I might have otherwise ignored. It taught me the importance of balance, of nurturing not just my relationships but also my own identity. It showed me that love isn't enough if it's one-sided, and that true partnership requires effort, communication, and respect from both people. To anyone reading this, wondering if they can survive the kind of heartbreak I went through, I want to say this: you can. It won't be easy, and there will be days when it feels like the pain will never end. But if you keep moving forward, one step, one day at a time, you'll find your way. And when you do, you'll realize that the life you build for yourself can be even more fulfilling than the one you lost. As for Sarah, I wish her no ill will. I hope she's found her own path to happiness, just as I've found mine. Because at the end of the day, life is too short to dwell on what could have been. It's about embracing what is and looking forward to what's yet to come.